They discovered him at dawn, concealed in the cellar of a deserted villa on the outskirts of Rome. The room stank of rot and vinegar. In his hand was a vial. Poison. He was scarcely 20. This was Sporus, once paraded as an empress, once the husband of Rome's ruler, now preferring a quick death to the spectacle the new emperor had devised for him in the arena. By morning, his sentence was prepared. No private end, no clemency, only a public display. He would be pulled into the Colosseum, defiled, and executed before a jeering audience as part of a play meant to ridicule Nero's memory. For Sporus, death was a mercy compared to performing again. For the past 3 years, he had not been permitted to be a person. He had been transformed into someone else, not in metaphor, but in body and mind. This is more than a tale of Roman brutality. It is history's most severe case of stolen identity, where an emperor didn't just take a life, but erased a boy to replace a dead wife. To understand the poison in that cellar, we must return 3 years to when Nero murdered the woman he adored and decided reality could no longer bind him. Rome, 65 AD. In his private rooms, the world's most powerful man committed murder. Poppaea Sabina, the pregnant empress, lay dying on the floor. Some say it was a single kick. Others describe a sustained beating. When Nero realized she was dead, he called for his doctors. But not even an emperor could undo death. Her loss broke something in Nero. When you govern millions and believe yourself destined by the gods, grief feels like defiance, a rule you cannot accept. He refused to burn her. Instead, he had her body preserved with fortune and spices, dressed in fine clothes, and sealed in a glass coffin so he could look upon her. He spoke to her, set her a place at dinner, asked her advice. He could not sleep without opium, woke screaming her name, and would only eat her favorite foods. Her rooms were kept exactly as she left them. The court waited for his grief to fade. It did not. It mutated. Soon, Nero saw Poppaea in every face, a servant pouring wine, a noblewoman in the street. He had prostitutes brought to him, gripping their chins, searching for a likeness. He commissioned portraits, and when they disappointed him, he raged or wept. Then came the change. While reviewing official appointments, a teenage freedman was brought before him. Nero looked up and froze. The boy was about 15. He had Poppaea's eyes. Not a similarity. The same eyes, the same bone structure, the same way of tilting his head, even the same light in his irises. Nero stood. The room was silent as he circled the boy, touching his face, studying him. This was not anger. It was a terrible, dawning hope. Your name? Nero whispered. Sporus, he replied. In that moment, Sporus stopped being a person. He became an answer. Sporus was a palace-born orphan, educated and delicate, trained as a clerk. None of that mattered now. Nero kept him in luxurious rooms. Artists drew him. Doctors measured him. Tutors listened to his speech. Nero compared every detail to Poppaea, noting what was wrong. Sporus was told not to use his name. Servants called him my lady. His clothes were replaced with gowns. His face was painted. His voice was trained to be higher and softer. Then Nero decided. Sporus would not just look like Poppaea. He would be her. Doctors were called. Tools were prepared. The change would be permanent, and it would start with a knife. But first came the planning. Nero studied Sporus like material, not a person. The boy lived in beautiful rooms, treated with hollow kindness. Artists sketched him. Doctors measured his bones. Nero noted every difference. Sporus lost his name. Servants called him Domina. He wore Poppaea's colors, purple, gold, pink. Cosmetics reshaped his face. Nero corrected his posture, his gestures, his walk. Then the voice lessons. For hours, Sporus repeated words, making his voice lighter, softer. Again, slower, like this. Every mistake was remembered, and slowly, something worse than pain. He began to live in a silent fog. Sporus spoke only when addressed directly. He ate only when food was placed before him. He moved through the palace corridors like a ghost inhabiting a dream that belonged to someone else, for he now comprehended the truth. This was not a temporary charade. This was a final, unalterable state. The physicians were called, not in secret, but with public ceremony. Nero discussed the impending operation with fervent delight, as a sculptor might speak of finally liberating a form from stone. The goal surpassed mere castration, a practice Rome knew well. That was mere subtraction. This was to be an act of creation. The doctors were offered unimaginable prizes, estates, fortunes, imperial favor. They were also made to understand the consequence of refusal or failure, death. The procedures they designed exceeded all medical tradition. They were irreversible interventions meant to mimic, as closely as contemporary science permitted, the physical form of a woman. On the eve of the surgery, Nero visited Sporus alone. He carried a small cedar box. Inside rested Poppaea's bridal ring, a heavy emerald set within a circle of pearls. Taking Sporus's hand, Nero slid the ring onto his finger. It was too large. "Tomorrow," Nero said, his voice soft, "you will be born anew. You will finally become your true self, and I will cherish you as I cherish her." Sporus's voice was a dry whisper after hours of silence. "Will it hurt?" For a fleeting second, something like pity shone in Nero's gaze. Then it was gone. "All birth involves pain," he answered, "but the result justifies the suffering." The operation consumed many hours. The historical record omits the specifics, but not the testimony is sound. Screams emanated from the medical quarters, carrying far beyond the insulated walls. Servants marked the passage of time by how long the cries lasted. Nero waited outside, not with anxiety, but with impatience. He spoke to the closed door, offering encouragement and comfort, like an expectant father awaiting a delivery. Sporus did not regain consciousness for days. His convalescence stretched over months. The threat of infection was constant. Fever waxed and waned. His body had to relearn its most fundamental rhythms. Throughout, Nero remained a constant presence, regulating doses for pain, examining wounds, reciting Poppaea's preferred poetry aloud. In the evenings, he narrated stories, memories Sporus had never experienced but was now required to know. The boundary between actual history and implanted past began to dissolve, as did the line separating Sporus from the phantom he was being forced to embody. When Sporus could finally stand, the instruction recommenced with renewed intensity. Tutors drilled him incessantly on poise. Shorter strides, a demure downward glance, a gentle sway of the hips, hands taught to handle a wine jug with art. Full grace. He was schooled in the proper way to recline at feasts, to gesture with submission rather than authority. The voice lessons grew more rigorous, higher, softer, ever more controlled. Again, a new wardrobe followed, not mere garments, but recreations. Seamstresses reproduced Poppaea's most famous gowns from saved templates. Jewelers resized her personal ornaments to fit Sporus's transformed physique. Her signature scents were replicated using the same exotic essences imported from the empire's edges. Nothing was original. All was duplication, extending even to memory. Sporus was given Poppaea's biography to memorize. Her girlhood, her acquaintances, her former loves, her stated views. When Nero shared a reminiscence, Sporus was expected to respond as if he recalled it too. Any lapse was met with a cold, perilous silence. 6 months after the surgery, Nero presented his masterpiece. At an intimate supper for his inner circle, Sporus made his entrance. All conversation halted. Wine cups hung suspended in air. The likeness was unsettling. In the flattering lamplight, with cosmetics expertly applied, Sporus looked eerily like the deceased empress. In his carriage, his expressions, his rehearsed smile. Nero watched the guests' faces closely. He held Sporus with proprietor's grip, introducing him without a trace of irony. "My beloved Sabina." The courtiers grasped the rules instantly. They played their part. Flattery flowed. Polite questions were posed. The hall filled with manufactured merriment. Reality warped under the pressure of collective survival, but not entirely. A few observed the telltale signs. The hand perhaps too large, the shoulders a touch too wide, the voice that sometimes cracked under duress. Worse were the instants when Sporus's own essence surfaced. A perceptive comment, a wit that was uniquely his, a profound sadness unrelated to Poppaea. Each time this happened, Nero would withdraw, turning icy and remote. The warning was unambiguous. Perfect performance or be discarded. The nuptial proclamation came next. In early 67 AD, the Emperor Rome would take a bride, Sabina. The preparations advanced with a horrifying semblance of normality. Priests arranged the sacrifices. Legal advisors pored over matrimonial statutes. Invitations were dispatched to every senator and official in the city. The ritual adhered scrupulously to tradition. Sporus was draped in the saffron-hued veil of a Roman bride. Contracts were sealed, dowry terms transferred, sacred vows exchanged. In keeping with custom, Nero carried him across the threshold. The wedding feast was a spectacle of excess. Peacocks, wines from the imperial cellar, ceaseless music. Poets offered verses extolling the union. Gifts piled high, jewels, talismans for fertility, domestic wares. Everyone smiled. Everyone applauded. For everyone understood the actual truth. This was not a romance. This was not a marriage. It was a consummation of a teenage boy's erasure, finalized before an empire too terrified to object. And a deeper horror still lay ahead. Marriage did not bring peace. It cemented the captivity. From the wedding day forward, Sporus vanished. Even in private, there were no respites from the role. Each morning followed the same script. Servants entered Poppaea's meticulously preserved chambers and roused him as if awakening the woman herself. Her jewels lay waiting on trays. Her gowns hung in precise sequence. Even the room's fragrance, frankincense, myrrh, attar, rose, had been duplicated from memory. His hair was styled, his face painted, his movements corrected. No full-length mirrors stood in the room, only smaller ones that showed fragments, a mouth that was not his own, eyes trained to appear gentler, hands learning gestures believable enough to pass. Nero demanded total immersion. Sporus did not eat as himself, speak as himself, or rest as himself. He was required to react not simply as a woman, but specifically as Poppaea. When Nero sought intimacy, it was not passion he wanted, but verisimilitude. Did she laugh like this? Would she have paused here? Did she answer in that tone? Any flaw shattered the fragile illusion. And when the illusion broke, Nero grew perilous. Not with violence, but with a withdrawal that was worse. A cold, dismissive silence. For someone whose existence hinged on an emperor's approval, that silence felt like a death warrant. Public life offered no sanctuary. Nero exhibited his resurrected bride at every opportunity. The theater, the chariot races, religious rites, state functions. Sporus sat in the empress's box at the Colosseum while the populace gazed upon a phenomenon it could not quite comprehend. A figure clothed as a dead woman, accorded imperial honors, yet somehow off in ways no one dared articulate. The Roman populace adored a spectacle. This was the most bizarre they had ever witnessed. Some muttered, some sneered, some watched in uneasy quiet. No one spoke aloud. Silence was the price of survival. In 67 AD, Nero departed Rome for a grand tour of Greece. Sporus accompanied him. The performance traveled with them. The Greeks, eager to please their imperial patron, received Sabina with full honors. Lavish feasts were held in her name. Priests invoked the gods for the couple's prosperity. The fiction was so absolute, it teetered into delirium. Sporus presided over audiences, sat beside Nero at theatrical contests, and participated in rites reserved for a consort. Yet it was in private that the true corrosion occurred. Nero desired not merely a companion, but a reanimated memory. Sporus had to demonstrate knowledge of things he could never have known. Private jokes, quiet understandings, moments of tenderness that were another's. Every evening became a performance, and every mistake felt like a disaster. Contemporaries later described Sporus as occupying a liminal space. Neither man nor woman, neither slave nor citizen, neither living as himself, nor fully becoming Nero's vision. Servants sometimes discovered him alone in the gardens before sunrise, standing motionless, as if he had forgotten how to move without a command. There must have been attempts to flee, but Sporus was impossible to conceal. The jewels, the gowns, the face now known to all. One documented attempt ended swiftly. His accomplices were seized and crucified in the palace yard. Their bodies were left where Sporus could view them from his window. A brutal lesson. Escape multiplies suffering. After that, he stopped trying. The emperor's kindness. In his derangement, Nero was convinced he had restored his beloved. He guarded Sporus fiercely, lavished him with presents, spoke of eternal devotion, and displayed flashes of what seemed like genuine care. To observers, it mimicked affection. But love cannot flourish where selfhood has been annihilated. What Nero cherished was not a person, but an echo. Over time, the psychological toll became visible. Irvins noted our behaviors. Sporus began calling himself Poppaea, even in solitude. He spoke to mirrors, sometimes in two distinct voices, one soft, one his own, neither of them fully authentic. The young man's psyche adapted the only way left. It fractured. The empire fractures. Then Rome itself began to crumble. In early 68 AD, rebellions erupted across the provinces. The Senate turned hostile. The Praetorian Guard withdrew its loyalty. The man who once commanded the world found himself with nowhere to turn. When Nero fled Rome under darkness, Sporus was with him. Even as his power disintegrated, Nero would not relinquish his creation. Witnesses recounted the emperor clutching Sporus in those final hours, calling him my only love, my resurrection, pleading for a joint suicide like the tragic heroes of legend. When word arrived that capture was inevitable, Nero chose to die by his own hand. Yet the performance continued to the end. He asked Sporus to lead the ritual lamentations, to mourn him as Poppaea would have. As Nero pressed a dagger to his throat, his hands faltered. It was Sporus who steadied the blade, perhaps the single act of mercy either would ever know. Nero was dead. Sporus was at last free, or so it should have been. Freedom never arrived. Instead, his ownership transferred. With Nero gone, Sporus became a symbol, a trophy, a grotesque curiosity. Galba, the next emperor, kept him in the palace but ignored him. For months, Sporus remained in his ambiguous prison, still robed as a woman, still addressed as Sabina, but now a ghost in the halls. When Galba was murdered, Sporus passed to Otho. Otho had known the real Poppaea. She had once been his wife. His interest in Sporus was sinister. Historical sources suggest he contemplated marrying him, whether as a perverse revival or an act of vengeance, or both. Otho's reign ended quickly, in suicide after a military defeat. Then came Vitellius, and with him the end. Vitellius had no patience for illusions. To him, Sporus was mere entertainment. The decree was issued without subtlety. Sporus would appear in the Colosseum, not as an empress, but as a victim. He was to enact the myth of Proserpina, abducted, violated, and slain. He would be dragged into the arena, publicly assaulted, then executed, for Rome's amusement. When Sporus learned what awaited him, something long buried stirred. Choice. Rather than submit to one final, hideous performance, he chose death. The source's conflict, poison, open veins. What matters is that the decision was his. At roughly 20 years old, Sporus ended his life not as Poppaea, not as Sabina, but in defiance of further erasure. The warning. The story of Sporus is not merely one man's cruelty. It is a testament to what occurs when power is obeyed without conscience, when reality is traded for a convenient fiction, when an entire society selects complicity over humanity. Hundreds participated. Physicians, tutors, tailors, courtiers, priests, magistrates, all choosing survival at the cost of a single boy's existence. The real Sporus is lost to us forever. We do not know his dreams, his wit, his fears before Nero saw him. That person was erased so thoroughly that even his name may have been part of the jest. Yet in his final moment, when the Empire demanded one last role, he refused. And in that refusal, he reclaimed the only thing ever taken from him that could never truly belong to another, his own agency.